And we're gonna turn it over to Steve. We're really fortunate to have Steve back again. He presented a few months ago, and there was some questions and a request for follow-up. And so he's back again to talk about messy maps and what do you do with them, or how do you prevent them? Maybe, I'm not sure. Anyway, so Steve, I'll send it to you.
Thank you, Deanna. Welcome all. See if I can push the right buttons here and make a complete mess of things, because we like to have messy. Messy is a great way to start. Let me just start out with that.
And Steve, can I just interject something? I'm sorry. Please use the chat room to, one, let us know where you're from. Any questions, any references that you might think of as Steve's talking, share whatever you have. And we'll be sure and share the chat room after it's over. So now, Steve, I'm turning it over to you.
All righty, thank you again. Yes, indeed. This presentation is not going to be so systemic. It's really just a large collection of tips and techniques for dealing with messy maps, which, as Deanna hinted, could be taken in a couple of different ways. You could either start with a big messy map, which is always fun and interesting, and winnow it down into something simpler, more workable, or you can use these techniques from the start so that your map does not get overwhelmingly complicated, because a lot of people are put off by overwhelming maps. With that, let me see if, okay, I'm pushing buttons and there we go. So today we're going to start out with a very brief introduction, orientation, if you will. What is a map, how they're made, and the problem we face in balancing the complexity of the map with the usefulness or the workability. And just for organization's sake, some vague attempt at organization, I've clustered these into three basic areas: the human approach to simplifying maps or working with complex maps, graphic approach, and my favorite and the most difficult ones, structural approach. We should have plenty of time for questions and conversations at the end, but if something comes up along the way, please feel free to, as Deanna says, put something in the chat room. And if Deanna, if you can keep an eye on that, or somebody can keep an eye on the chats or the chat box and let me know to flag me, wave your hand wildly, and we can address it in the moment if possible, and or we can go backwards and forwards. So the first thing, what is a knowledge map? From my perspective, I think of these knowledge map as a kind of conceptual system, simply a diagram of how we believe that the world works. And very generally, these can be considered to be include a wide variety of metaphorical and other perspectives. It could be, you know, a model, a theory, policy theory, mind map assumptions, conceptual maps. All of these things generally fit into the category of a knowledge map. And they can be created through a wide variety of techniques. Do I have a laser point? I'm screen sharing. Can Deanna wave if you can see my arrow moving around upper left hand? Okay, great. So I'll use that for my pointer so I don't have to try and make the laser pointer work. You can take information from a literature review, theories from the academic literature. You can create big messy maps on walls. As Seymour was suggesting, you can do interviews, any old kind of data collection, or collaborations among experts, stakeholders. All of these can combine to create a wonderfully big messy map, which is a useful potentially useful representation of a shared understanding. And actually, I think this map came from our analysis of presidential candidates' economic theories or economic policies or perspectives. We're not going to actually delve into that. We're more looking at the messiness of it all. so you can avoid trying to read everything that's going on there. So just looking at the concepts and the connections, each concept, each idea, if you will, is in a separate circle or bubble, and all the connections generally tend to be causal connections. So if our maps are a representation of reality, and maps make decision-making easier, then supposedly decision-making is easier with better, messier maps, but the more effective or the more complete the representation of reality, the more complex our maps will be, and the messier those maps will be, which impedes the decision-making. So we've got some difficulty here trying to balance out the messiness of the map with the limits of our human cognition. So today we're going to look at the human focus, how people work together with maps, the graphic focus, how those maps are represented, and the structural perspective of how knowledge is understood as knowledge, and an important part of that is how everything is structured. We're going to look at within the human focus. Let's dive in there. There's looking at the various stakeholder foci and looking at partial maps, looking at nested maps, and working with online platforms. Partial maps, if you have a big messy map, you can simply take one little part of that at a time, and to do this you can simply talk with the stakeholders and say, well, gee, what parts are you specifically interested in, and simply focus on those, and then expand the map in size as the stakeholders build their competency, their comfort in working with such big messy maps. It's also useful if you're working with one map or one small partial map to keep in mind that they're connected with those other small partial maps. And as they build those competencies, start to put those small pieces together. Another way to approach it, and we did this with one of our consultants did this with a energy consortium. They had difficulty getting the entire consortium into the room to create a map at one time. So they would simply create a small map. Each stakeholder group created a small map on their own, and then those maps were eventually integrated or synthesized. Let's see, and then you can even reduce the complexity of the map by focusing on different parts of that, depending on the stakeholder group. So if you have one stakeholder group, for example, that has just a few concepts, they can focus on their map with the understanding that those other linkages are out there. So they get to this point and they say, okay, now we understand what we've done here. Now we have the opportunity to expand our thinking out to include the maps of other groups. Kent Fries, one of our top flight mapping consultants, did a strategic plan with a tech company 1 year, and they liked it so much they said, well, come back and do that again. He says, okay, you want to update and revise your strategic plan? They said, no, that all seems to be working okay. What they had decided to do instead was to drill down on some of the concepts that were a part of their strategic plan. For example, one of them was increasing the profit margin. Another was dealing with old technology that was sitting on the shelves and not getting sold. Another was cross-marketing between organizational functions. And so each of those were concepts within the strategic plan at a high level, and each of the drill down foci were sort of a whole nother knowledge map that was for each of the individual projects to be working on. Here, for example, you might have a board of directors making a map that's relatively simple, and one of those concepts might be fundraising, but the fundraising department might have it's a whole map by itself. And as the fundraising department works with their map, then they can integrate the results back at the board of directors level, and then use those high-level connections to connect with the work of other departments. You can also use online platforms. This is Plectica, which has a function so you can have multiple people online at one time, all of them working on a map, which is very handy. Jean does, wave your hand or give me a thumbs up or thumbs down. Hey, does Kumu have a live collaboration effect yet, or tool yet? Yes, no, hands, thumbs up, thumbs down.
You can have multiple people work on the map, but it's not updated in real time. You have to refresh the view.
Okay.
They say they want to do it, but they don't know when.
Okay, yeah, that's what I love about this. Thank you, Gene. Is that all of these, or many of these platforms, are continually working on improving their features and processes. It's almost frightening, difficult to keep up with. But so yeah, refreshing the screen, easy as the push of a button. So so that's another way to deal with the messy maps, or coordinating with people at a distance. We used a similar approach to this. We were doing a mapping process with a client, and several of their people were at remote locations. So we had one person who was on the computer screen facilitating the remote people and asking them their relevant questions to help them build the map and find connections. Okay, take a brief pause here. Any questions about the human approach to dealing with messy maps before we go on to graphics? Questions about what we've covered so far? No questions yet, please, about what we haven't covered, because, yes. Deanna?
Go ahead, Gene.
You have any experience with multiple people developing the map and none of them being co-located?
Oh, yeah,
Everybody's somewhere else?
No. With everybody co-located, or none of them co-located?
None of them co-located. They're all someplace else.
So they're all someplace else. The one I just described, I wasn't the one who was facilitating the group online. I was the Uber facilitator, and I believe most or all of those people were in dispersed locations. And I believe, if I recall correctly, the process involved everyone sharing the same screen and asking people to take turns. Person A, what do you think about this? Person B, what do you think about this? Okay, group as a whole, everyone, thumbs up, thumbs down. Does this look like it's going in the right direction? So then, sort of polling people. Mm-hmm.
And then one person doing all the updates.
Yes, one person is organizing the screen.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Do I see something popping up in the chat there?
Rudolph had a question. Rudolph, you want to ask your question?
Hi there. Thanks so much. My question is, last time Gina talked about telling the story of a map. My question is, how can you get people together to actually tell the story of what you want to be developing before you actually put the map together?
So it sounds like, I'm not sure if that's a question for Gene or for myself.
No, it's a question for you. So it's now coming the other way, saying, how can you help people to actually begin getting the flow of the story together before you actually go to the process of developing this map, as you explained just now?
Generally, if we bring people together, they are part of a coherent group, business or other organization, so they have some shared understanding and a shared topic that they know that they're going to be working on. That might answer it. Another approach that we've used is to interview individual experts or individual people, stakeholders, and then take from those interviews, put that together on the map. And we might start out with a relatively simple map and then ask them to build upon it. Is that?
Yeah, I think.
Does that more or less answer your question?
Yeah, it's helpful to start with simple concepts, and then just build it more complicated over time. Thank you.
Yes, yes. And Tracy, to everyone in the Seattle area interested in knowledge maps might support Saybrook dissertation process, clinical psychology work. Tracy, drop me an email. I'm actually gearing up to start a project that might be very similar to that. And also, I've run workshops on using a knowledge map as part of a literature review process, so that you can actually see how your work at doing the literature review and the research adds to improved knowledge. So there's some definite possibilities there.
That sounds great. Thank you so much. I will do that.
Sure.
And I'm going to put Steve's email address in the chat box.
Oh, thank you.
And it'll also be at the end of the presentation. Okay, onward to the online platforms. I forgot to. So there's some online platforms that was pretty messy.
Steve, I was going to ask you
yes.
how you determine which online platform you use, because I know there's several, and I'm sure you've probably tested all of them.
Well, I don't even know what all of them are. There are so many out there. We'll get to those in a minute. Okay. This is Plectica. I'll discuss a few others, but basically it's kind of a trade-off between intuitive, how easy it is to use, and what features you want to have within it. And I'll mention 3 of my favorites later on. So into the graphic focus, which is about the simplest part of this. Don't cross the lines, make groups, and use online platforms. These are all the same figure, really. It's just that and this is one of the difficulties of starting out, as Seymour and I were talking about earlier, with messy maps. You start to write it up on a board, and you start to realize that, all the lines are crossing and confused. And the whole process of untangling them, though, is as you move from tangled to untangled, can help improve understanding and clarity. It might almost be worthwhile giving people an extremely messy map to help them untangle it and improve their knowledge that way. I didn't have time to work it into the process, but Rudolph also sent me a map that he was working on, and you can see that it's color-coded. Here, for example, you can simply add colors to the various things you might have. For example, resources, activities, short-term outcomes, long-term outcomes, or various colors by stakeholder groups, and that's a very handy process. This is a map from Kumu, and the function is called decorate. So you look for decorations, and you can change your colors fairly easily, and organize the map that way. That helps to draw people's attention to the various parts of it. And to tap into Gene's knowledge again, is there a function that untangles all the nodes in Kumu? No, not yet. One of these days. Okay, focus more on, you can also simply group and just say, okay, on this side of the map, we're going to have our resources. In the middle of the map, we're going to have our activities. And on the other side of the map, we're going to have the results. And that helps to make the map much more accessible. Okay, some of those online platforms we were talking about. Kumu has just a huge number of features, and you can certainly talk with Gene about that to get to those in depth. And he has made a magnificent library of instructional videos, including using Kumu to explain how Kumu works. Insight Maker is also very intuitive. It's one of those you just hover over it and or right click on a box or click on the empty screen and stuff pops up as almost as easy as possible. If you happen to be into computer modeling, Insight Maker is the one to go with, as far as I know. Plectica is a newbie to the field, and they are continually increasing in tools, techniques, and this sort of thing. Also very easy to work with. I'm going to try this. I'm not sure if it's going to work or not. Nah, not really. But if you follow this link here, if you're able to identify it, or if you just go to Kumu and search for PECI, PECI is the Pacific Energy Consortium Incorporated. They have a very nice presentation. I think that serves as a really great example of how you can use Kumu to pull out various parts of the map and present one part at a time for a great presentation of a messy map. For example, you can have an extremely messy map, and then you focus in on one small part of it, then pull back to the larger map and focus it. I hope these spine-tingling special effects are helpful for explaining what I'm talking about. Okay, that's it for the graphic side of things. Any questions about graphics online platforms before we move on to the structural approach to dealing with messy maps?
Steve, you have any experience with CMAP?
Not a lot. I think I must have seen it at some point along the way, but have passed it by. Okay. But that's another popular one.
Is there a cost? Is there a cost to using these platforms?
Oh, that's right. All of these. Another reason I like them is because I'm a cheapskate, and all of these are available for free at some level of usefulness. If you use them a lot or use a large number of features, you have to pay. But even that cost is pretty minimal.
Great, thank you.
Sure. I see somebody popping up in the chat box here. Sometimes, Bernadette says, when circles are very interconnected, yes, it's impossible to uncross all the lines. This is true. We try. Oh, and Rudolph says CMAP is free also, so that's good. Yes, sometimes it's impossible to get all the lines untangled, but it's certainly worth the effort to try. And generally, I found I can get most of them untangled at a certain level of complexity. Okay. Let's move on to, I forgot, computer modeling. Here's a relatively simple map for a computer model. Of course, they can be much more complex, but then why even look at the model? Sometimes the clients would just prefer to see the graphic results. That takes a complex computer model and makes it a whole lot simpler for the client after they've completely lost their minds making it a tremendously complex map. Okay, structural. My favorite part, because I look at this, when we talk about knowledge mapping, we say that a logic structure or structure of the map is very much our representation of knowledge. If you simply have a range of bullet point concepts, those could be understood as data. Not quite the same thing as knowledge, not nearly as useful. So the more that our maps are structured, the more concepts we have, the more interconnected, the more useful it is for knowledge. So to me, this is the exciting new part of this whole thing. And we'll go through a whole bunch of those, some of them simpler than others. So let's say you're starting out with a very large, messy map, but some of those some of those may be measurable, some of them may not be measurable, some of those you might not have access to the data. And one simple way to simplify is just say, you know what, if we can't measure it, we can't manage it. So we're just going to ignore those parts of the map that we don't have measures for. Oh, by the way, the flip side of this is if you're going to choose to ignore parts of the map, which is difficult for some of us who like to continually expand our minds, those ignored parts are also the parts where you have opportunities for additional exploration. But sometimes you have, for example, a small group with limited resources. And Bernadette and I did that as we were mapping out some business possibilities. We were having tons of fun mapping, and it came out to be a really neat and interesting and useful map. And as we went along, we realized that we were, 2 people with a map that would have been useful for 10 people. 2 people simply cannot keep up with the large messiness of the map. Causality is the best path to scientific understanding. So similarly, if you have a large, messy map, you can simply ignore those parts that are not causal, because I know this is a point of contention with some of us. Some people have a different appreciation of causality than others, but since I'm standing up here doing the presentation, we'll go with that. We can discuss causality later on. Let's see. Atomistic redundancy. If you end up with multiple concepts on the map, and this especially happens if you have multiple groups creating separate maps, they might end up with very similar concepts, and those can simply be all made into the same thing. Instead of having 3 different concepts that essentially seem to be the same thing, there's an overlap there. You just make them into one concept. Call it what you will. You can also have a linear redundancy where A causes B, causes C, causes D. You can get the same essential results by saying, let's cut out the middleman and say A causes D. This can be a problem, though, if stakeholders have a vested interest in B and C. You don't want to have those removed from the map because they feel that they're important. So you'd want to then ask them to do something with B and C and make them more robust by adding additional connections or building it into a causal loop. Speaking of loops, I've got a paper, as mentioned to some people, accepted that'll be presented at the ASC conference this year, and then who knows what's going to happen with it. But it seemed to me, based on my review of the literature and thinking this thing through, that your simplest, clearest loop, as Gene would say, what's the minimal loop? Got to have 2 components, 2 concepts, and each has a causal relationship with the other. If you build out additional loops from that, those seem to be in parallel, and in some sense redundant. And it may be that the best way to understand that, or to look at that very messy map, is to forget about those parallel loops. And how that's done is you might be able to abstract those into the main loop, or build them into separate loops if the information or the concepts or data here are considered to be important and you don't want to lose them completely. But for simplification, cut those out and just focus on the smallest possible loop. It also makes enumeration of loops a whole lot easier. Categorization or abstraction, you can take a large number of concepts that are part of your map and say, yeah, we're just going to pull those off to the side and we're going to make those into one concept. This does require some careful thinking. If you have apples, pears, bananas, oranges, what are you abstracting them to? Are you abstracting them to say they are all in the category of fruit, or that they all have some level of sweetness, or there's some color that they have in common? That's a topic for good discussion for the group. But abstracting a number of concepts out gives you a fewer number of concepts. And when you do this, you do want to keep the causal connections if appropriate. So that's a whole nother topic of conversation for the group. This is a map we created for, I think, a NeighborWorks America. This is the professional-facing map. This is what they said. Okay, this is how we as professionals understand what's going on in our system. They also wanted a simpler map to use for client presentation. So we developed a client-facing map by abstracting out as far as possible to say, okay, well, here's some concepts that we could put up on a projection screen and talk with the clients. Just simply use this as a touchstone for a client presentation and encouraging client conversations. So pulling all that out of there and using, categorizing or abstracting to make a much simpler model is definitely a useful approach. For those of you who've been following our fun and interesting methods of presentation and knowledge mapping, we like to have concepts that have more than one arrow pointing to them. You might think of this is the dependent variable versus the independent variable. You might think of it as multiple views of the same thing, but ultimately those concatenated or transformative concepts with more than one arrow pointing at them, these are the ones that are more actionable, better understood. So hypothetically, you could cut some of the extraneous concepts out of the map and just focus on those ones that are pointing directly at the transformative, actionable concepts. You can use the same thing with a loop perspective. One could very reasonably say that only the stuff in a loop is stuff that's well understood. Therefore, let's cut out all the extraneous material and simply focus on what's inside the loop. And again, I'm not saying that these are the best or optimal, but these are simplifying approaches to knowledge mapping. You can also take leverage points, and this, by the way, a point of warning, Donna Meadows' approach to leverage points says, look for some place in the organization where a small amount of effort can create a large amount of change. And it's rather fuzzy after that, exactly what that point is. And since that point could be very different for different people, I find that not optimal. But from our structural perspective, we can say that a leverage point is where two or more loops intersect. And so at that one point here, then getting that, taking action at that one point will have effects for both loops. So that to me makes much more sense as a structural leverage point where you want to do some change. So you can have a relatively complex map that has a lot of loops in it, but make it easier for people to work with by focusing on the leverage points. There's the core and belt of a model. What we like to say from a structural perspective is the core is where more concepts are connected, and the belt are those concepts that are less connected. They might even have no connections at all. So you can simply dismiss those less connected parts of the model to focus on the central, which in this case is still rather complex, but it would help. Scale of abstraction. Excuse me, not used to talking this much. I like to facilitate so everyone else does the talking. Sometimes you'll end up with a very complex map or model or theory, and one difficulty of that is that the concepts are at different levels of abstraction. You might have the concept of plant and fruit and apple all on the map. Those should all be combined into a similar level of abstraction. So all of the plant concepts, if you want to go to a higher level of abstraction, you can take all the apples and combine them with all the fruits, and so that you only have the very highest level of abstraction. That would be the simplest. And or you can look at moving the plants into a lower level of abstraction, more concrete, and apples into a higher level of abstraction. So you try to get everything focused around the middle. Now, I thought I saw something popping up on the chat box.
It was Marty. She was giving us a reference.
Sharing link. Oh, okay, great. Great article about leverage points. Yes, intervening in systems. I would love to have a discussion and argument, but since Donna Meadows passed away at much too young an age, that can't quite happen, I'm afraid. Okay, so moving on from scale of abstraction. We're just about at the end here, so start gearing up your question. This is the paper I'm working on right now. Orthogonality is possibly the highest level of mapping for the deepest understanding. With abstraction, you could, for example, say that, oh, our online sales bring us in money, our storefront sales bring us money, and the sales from our mailers bring us money, and those all come together to have the money from sales. That's not really orthogonal, because all of these sales approaches to sales or sources of sales can be abstracted into. With orthogonality, we're looking at very different concepts that are potentially 90 degrees or orthogonal to each other. You can have raw materials, workers, and tools, and all of these can come together to a finished product, which we're going to call furniture. We could call chairs, whatever else you'd like it to be. The difference here is that if you had 0 online sales, you would still have income from the other kinds of sales. If you have successfully changed your concepts or reduced your concepts to the most orthogonal, then if you have 0 raw materials, you will have 0 furniture, 0 workers, 0 furniture, 0 tools, 0 furniture. So if any one of these concepts, if you have a map where any concept can be reduced to 0 and things are still happening, things are still changing on the map, then that concept could be and probably should be abstracted or categorized with some other concept or concepts until they get to the point where they, if you reduce one to 0, such as raw material, and there's no output, then you cannot get more abstract than that. So that's, if anybody wants to experiment or help me write a paper on that, please let me know.
Steve, I have a question.
Yes.
A couple slides back, you showed the map, and then there was a lot dispersed on the out. Yeah, that one. So when you delete some of those that are not as connected, do you do any analysis on that to see if you're missing something, or what's your process for ensuring that you should delete?
Yeah, the rule of thumb for deletion is that, you know, things that are not connected are to anything are the least useful in terms of knowledge, in terms of decision making. If there's a concept that something like our organization is the best in the whole world, and it's not connected to anything, but everybody is rallying around saying that's a really important thing, we want to keep that on the map, then we would encourage the client to say, okay, well then show us what are the causal connections. Let's take it from the belt and bring it into the core. Otherwise, another approach would be, you know, good old dot voting or something like that, or perhaps, you know, choosing what people find the most meaningful or relevant. But this is simply a structural approach saying these are the ones that are less connected, and therefore we're going to take them out of the map just to improve the clarity of what's remaining. The other part of the process is if they are not connected, we want to try to make them to be connected. Now, what we also want to do is encourage people to mute their phones.
Yeah,
but
we're getting some
the
feedback.
Person is, somebody's having a lovely conversation that doesn't involve the rest of us. Did we do it? Okay, good.
I think
sounds muted. Thank you. It's just the worst thing is when they go on and they don't realize what's happening. Oh yes, Marty, yeah. Social network analysis can also help people understand the connections or the lack thereof and their value. Yes, indeed. And we find this with network analysis or any sort of mapping where, yes, if we have disconnected concepts, it's whether it's the human network or the or the structure of what's going on, the actions within the network, the organization, we want to say, hey, why is that disconnected? Sorry, flashback. That's actually one of my. I was still going to graduate school back in the day, and took some of these processes into my workplace, and as part of the safety committee. And for the last year or so, it had become increasingly clear that the safety committee was not really an effective part of the organization. So we sat down and we mapped it out and realized that there were no connections, no serious actionable connections between the safety committee and top management. So whatever the safety committee did kind of drifted off into space. So that led to some great conversations and top management being involved in reorganizing the safety committee and a member of top management becoming a permanent member of the safety committee. So the whole thing became that much more useful and operational and effective. Rudolph asks, sorry, yeah?
I was just going to say, Gene's got his hand raised.
Oh, yes, Gene. Did you have a question, comment, Gene?
Rudolph could go first. That's okay.
Okay. Rudolph is asking to explain orthogonality to simplify maps. So let's say, for example, we were using this tremendously complex map, and we found that there were a number of them that could be, let's see, let's look over here. Okay, here we have multiple concepts pointing into one concept here. And we realized that some of them are not orthogonal or can be categorized. Then those can be clumped or overlapped, and one of them would be combined into the other or deleted. And we continue that process, focusing on those causal elements that are pointing into resulting elements, and then those to the next, and so on, so that we're reducing the number of concepts on the map. Rudolph, did that help?
Hello,
hopefully
thanks.
That helps.
In some way, I'm not quite, I don't quite understand the difference between the two types of maps you were showing, where some of them would be adding together, could be running parallel, and others would cancel each other out. I don't understand how these two different concepts could be used to either simplify maps or leave them as they are.
So on the one on the right or the left here, the online sales, storefront sales, this can be used to simplify the map because these can all be categorized into sales. And perhaps I've confused myself, if not everybody else. You have to stop categorizing or stop reducing the maps when the concepts are orthogonal to each other. Perhaps another way to look at it is that these are additive, whereas these are multiplicative.
Yes.
Okay.
But you mean when they're multiplicative, you can't reduce them further?
Exactly.
Okay. So it's like what Einstein said, make it as simple as possible, but not more simple.
No simpler, indeed.
Yes.
Although we're looking at this, and hypothetically, it might be, I say, I have to write the paper, have to get these thoughts all figured out. It might be that an important part of this orthogonality process is the perspective. For example, if a very high level board of directors of multiple corporation, they might see raw materials, workers, and tools all as categorized in terms of resources to the furniture company. I'm not sure how that would all work out. That would be the matter of some other conversations. And I think there was something from Bernadette.
Yeah, I was going to ask you to talk about that a little bit.
All right, define the connection and how the knowledge is passed on. Oh, wait a minute, that's it, sorry. Social network analysis looks at social relationships between people. Knowledge mapping looks at causal relationships between concepts. Yes, that's an important distinction between social network analysis. You're looking at some kind of measure of how connected people are, whether it's, you know, where the communication goes or how much communication there is between people, or reporting relationships, these sort of things. Whereas with causal knowledge mapping, we're looking at how one thing causes change in another. For example, here, the more raw materials we have, the more furniture we're able to make. The more workers we have, the more furniture we're able to make, and so on. So that's an important distinction. The distinction should also be made with concept mapping. With concept mapping, you might say, for example, cows in one box eat in a line, and then grass in the other box, which may be useful, but in our experience and research is not as useful for decision making or developing a shared understanding for these for groups decision making. Marty says you can define what the connection is, so it could be how knowledge is passed on. Yes, but yes, primary basis of social networks. Yes, yes. All of these have some level of knowledge, but I think only with causal knowledge mapping are we able to see, you know, how much knowledge there is and how useful that knowledge is, and which makes for a very tricky trade-off between a very large, complex, messy map and something that is small and smaller, more easily understood, but perhaps not as useful for sharing knowledge and decision making. If you had simply one point on the map that says, you know, our company should be the greatest in the world, what are people going to do with that? It might be a good starting point for conversation, but by itself, it is not a good map, because every person who looks at that is going to have a different perspective on what it means and what should be done as a result of it. And Bernadette says on the orthogonality slide, which is the one we're at, if the map included circles that cause more online sales specifically than online sales, then online sales would have to stay on the map. Ooh, interesting question. I'm going to have to think about that. That's
Steve, Rudolph had a question prior to that one.
I did not catch that. Let me just jot down.
And then we still have Jean with a raised hand back there.
Jean, it's because you're sitting so far in the back of the room, Jean. Bernadette, I'm afraid I don't have an answer for that. I'm going to have to give that some serious thought. And Rudolph says you showed a complex map of an industry sector from the perspective of the organization. How would you go about shifting such a map to the perspective of the customers? Ooh, interesting question. I would involve the customers to the greatest extent possible. And a good approach to this, I can't take credit for it exactly, but I forget exactly where credit is due. Somebody might remind me. You can have, for example, the organization taking their map and saying, this is how the world looks to us. And then you can present that to the customers, and the customers say, well, this is how we perceive it happening. And then you can synthesize or integrate the two together to get a more complete picture or perspective. And that's tremendously useful for both sides to help their understanding of each other. So Rudolph, I hope that helps.
Now, Jean.
Thanks so much.
Pleasure. Jean, you've been waiting patiently this week.
I got time. I've always thought that you should never use a tool that's more complex than what you need to get the job done. Okay. And though, while I say that, you also have to be, to some extent, aware of the capabilities of alternatives, because you never know what you're going to need if you don't know what exists. I say that specifically looking at this picture because somebody pinged me the other day to go look at Plexica again, which I looked at 6 months ago and said, that. And now, looking at all the videos I could find the other day, this particular picture, you could go ahead and create dollars from sales, and you could have the 3 components as subcomponents of that entity, and you could fold it up in the model itself so that you don't have to see it unless you have a question about what does that mean. In the same way with furniture, you could say, well, furniture is a concept, and I have abstracted raw material, workers, and tools to be furniture. And if somebody comes along, which always happens, to say, what does that mean? You can simply click and unfold it to say, here's the things that we took into account. So there were some very nice things that I found that they have added to Plexica.
Yes, thank you, Gene. Yes, and this is a whole part of. Yeah, I look at it as as an ecosystem where all of these platforms are evolving themselves and competing against one another. So good for us consumers at the end somewhere. And yes, Gene, I think you touched on something, and Deanna, we should probably have somebody, not necessarily me, do a whole presentation on all, take one or more of these platforms and show all of those ins and outs, because what Gene said, I completely should have had in this presentation, because there are platforms where you can simply click and expose, a whole another branch so that you can follow those branches along.
So Gene,
yeah, there's a lot to be done there.
Yeah, Gene's going to be sharing a lot about Kumo coming up. So Gene, you may want to put that link in the chat box to share what you're doing.
Okay, I'll do that.
Yeah, and yes, the question about oversimplification versus undersimplification, what we generally do with clients is they create their own map. So that gives them a sense of acceptance and understanding of it. We do that with a few simple rules, so that if you have multiple, let's say you have a client with, let's say 20 people in the leadership team, and they're sitting at 5 different tables with, 4 people at each table, then they know that each map has been made according to the same rules, so they have some faith and trust in the whole process as they start to link their maps with each other. And an important part of that is them making their own maps. Another part of it is helping them into it in a slow and stable process, so that they understand the process and they build the maps themselves. And as they build those maps, the maps increase in complexity, and they're building their mapping competency as that goes along. So, and we expect that as clients work with these over the years, that they will continue to improve their competency, and those organizations, I think, will have a what is it called, a strategic advantage over other organizations, because they will be able to look at a complex map, understand it, share the information, the knowledge, focus their conversations, and be able to use that to make effective decisions more quickly than other organizations. So,
Gene, is that a new raised hand, or
Yeah, that's a new raised hand.
Oh,
The people actually learn how to think differently without you trying to teach them how to think differently, simply by going through the exercise and the discipline of saying, this relates to this, and this is what I think the relationship is. And as they continue to do that, they begin to develop a habit of thinking about more than cause and effect.
Yes, as usual, yes.
But if you go to them and say, I want to teach you about why you should think about more than cause and effect, you lost.
Absolutely. When we first started doing knowledge mapping, we would go to the clients and try to teach them all the concepts, and then go to the mapping, but we lost them along the way. So what we do now is teach them the very smallest part. Here's the very smallest, the very easiest part to mapping. Go to it. And then along the way, say, oh, look what they've done over here. They've got a whole loop. Everybody should be making loops. So they are brought along one step at a time as they do the work. So as usual, Gene, I'm going to agree, at least 100%. And that seems to work. That seems to work very well. And I think that actually speaks to it. If I can be a troublemaker and a heretic, one of the greatest problems of systems thinking is that we're trying to teach people or trying to tell people about how they should be thinking systemically instead of kind of leading them, one step at a time into a more systemic perspective and having them, as you say, work with those ideas and putting them together.
And to experience it. Yeah.
To experience it, yes. And that's part of my shameless plug and call to action here with the book. So most or all of these concepts are built into the book, and we hardly mention systems thinking at all in the book. Mm-hmm. We simply say, here is how it's done, and this is how you put the pieces together. And, somewhere in the back of one chapter, there's some additional resources. So part of our, or at least my secret goal here, is to infiltrate interdisciplinary and systems thinking into the research paradigm. And the reviewers are quite excited about this book, and so we hope to get it into a lot of classrooms for research and program evaluation. So please tell your friends and colleagues and buy it sometime in the next 4 weeks before the price goes up.
I'm extremely pleased that you didn't put systems thinking in the title.
But you'll notice the cover looks like a lot of systems are going on. Marty, yes, the priority code is when you go to the SAGE website, it will ask you for the priority code, and that will get you a 30% discount on the pre-purchase price, which gets it to a reasonable price. One of the reasons we like working with SAGE is that they don't overcharge too much on their books.
So Steve, we have one more question from Rudolph that I think is important. And we're right up to the hour, so let's try to get that in.
Perfect. I've used CMAP. What would be some of the basic rules you use for teams for mapping? Rudolph, you give me 30 seconds to answer this?
You can take a little more.
I can, maybe it'll take 32 seconds, but the basic rules are this. You put one concept or one idea in one box or one circle, write that down, put it on the table. Each person takes turns as they go along. Once there's 2 or more concepts on the table, they can place an arrow to connect them, and the arrow is causal, and to test it, it's a good causal arrow. You ask, if there's more of this, will that cause more of that, or is that one of the causes for getting more of that? And then everybody at the table votes and says, yeah, that seems reasonable, so that everybody in the table on a piece-by-piece, point-by-point process agrees that everything in the map is reasonable and valid.
Sounds good.
And it's still 10 o'clock. Okay.
Yeah.
So thank you, Deanna, for inviting me, and thank you all for attending. Is there anything else we need to cover, Deanna?
I don't think so. I'll send out the recording and the chat box to everybody that's registered, which is more, of course, than as actually attending. And then I think we need to explore maybe some mapping workshop kind of online sessions to really get into those programs. Jean's going to be doing that with Kumo, but I think also looking at all the others and that we can compare them, because that helps our mental exercise too, and expanding how we think about systems. So, but thank you, Steve, for your time and all your knowledge, and thanks everyone for joining. And we'll be in touch. Bye.
A pleasure to talk with you all. A pleasure to have you here.
Yep. Our pleasure.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.